The richest man with the emptiest table. Let me tell you about a man who had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. His name was Edward Grant, and on Valentine's Day of 1886, he was the wealthiest bachelor in the whole of Briarwood County, Wyoming Territory. Folks in town talked about him the way folks talk about weather: constant, predictable, and without much expectation of change. Edward's ranch spread across 600 acres of prime grassland, bordered by cottonwood creeks and sheltered by ridge lines that broke the worst of the winter wind. The house itself was something to see. 2 stories of milled timber, glass windows shipped from Denver, a parlor with a stone fireplace wide enough for a man to stand inside. Fine place, grand, even. But on that Valentine's evening, with snow coming down soft and steady across the valley, the silence inside those walls pressed against a man like something with weight. Edward sat alone at a dining table built for 8. 1 plate, 1 glass, 1 setting of silver his mother had left him, polished by a housekeeper who came Tuesdays and Fridays. The fireplace held nothing but cold ash. He hadn't bothered lighting it in weeks. No point warming a room where nobody sat. No point setting a fire nobody would gather around. He was 37 years old. He'd built this place from a modest inheritance into a cattle empire through discipline, shrewd trading, and a willingness to work harder than any hand he employed. The town respected him. The bank trusted him. Women at church socials smiled in his direction with varying degrees of subtlety. But Edward had spent so many years building fences around his land, around his ledgers, around his heart, that the inside of those fences had gone quiet as a graveyard. Supper grew cold. He pushed back from the table, pulled on his sheepskin coat, and stepped onto the porch. The snow fell in thick, quiet curtains across the yard. Stars hid behind cloud cover. The barn was a dark shape against darker hills. Then he heard it. Not the familiar shuffle of horses or the creak of timber settling in the cold. Something smaller, something human. A cough. Thin and muffled and unmistakable. A child's cough. Edward lifted the lantern from its hook beside the door. His boots crunched through fresh snow as he crossed the yard, breath clouding in the February air. He pulled the barn door open, raised the light, and the amber glow fell across 3 small faces huddled together in the hay. The eldest, a girl no more than 11, stepped forward immediately. She positioned herself between the lantern and the 2 smaller children behind her. Chin lifted, shoulders set, eyes burning with the kind of courage that only comes from having nothing left to lose. Edward Grant stood still in the doorway. The lantern trembled in his hand. "We have no one." The girl's dress had been patched so many times the original fabric was just a memory. Behind her, a boy of about 8 clutched a bundle wrapped in burlap, and the youngest, a small boy of 5 at most, pressed his face into his sister's back with both fists twisted in her hem. "We ain't stealing nothing, sir." The girl's voice was steady, rehearsed. She'd spoken these words before, to other men, at other doors. "We just needed someplace out of the snow." Edward lowered the lantern slowly. "How long you been in here?" "Since yesterday evening. We waited till your hands left for the bunkhouse." She swallowed hard. "We'll be gone come sunup. Won't cause you no trouble." "Where are your folks?" Silence. The middle boy looked at his boots. The youngest pressed harder into his sister's back, and the hay rustled beneath his small, shivering body. "Gone," "Sir," the girl said quietly, "typhoid took 'em both. Last October." Edward knelt. The lantern light softened across their faces, and he saw them clearly now. Thin cheeks sharp enough to cast shadows. Dark circles beneath eyes too old for the faces carrying them. The youngest was trembling despite being buried in hay, and his lips had a bluish tint that made Edward's stomach clench. "What's your name?" "Mary, sir. Mary Colton. This here's James." She nodded toward the middle boy. "And the little one's Thomas." "Where have you been since October?" "Mary," she told him. "Uncle Harold in Cheyenne. 2 weeks before he said 3 children were too many mouths. Aunt Fay in Laramie, who kept them a month. Then said she couldn't manage. A cousin in Rock Springs, who wouldn't even open his door all the way. Everyone says we're too many." The rehearsed steadiness cracked. Just barely. Just enough. "We have no one. Can we stay in your barn? We'll work hard. James can carry water, and I can mend clothes, and Thomas don't eat much, sir. He really don't." Edward opened his mouth to speak. Nothing came. His throat had closed around something sharp and hot that he couldn't swallow, and his vision blurred before he understood why. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, but it didn't help. Mary saw it before he felt the tears reach his jaw. She stared at him, startled, as if she'd never seen a grown man's face do what his was doing. When he finally found his voice, it was rough as unplaned wood, but it was certain. "You ain't staying in any barn." He carried Thomas. Mary held James's hand. They crossed the snowy yard toward the house, and Edward Grant did something he hadn't done all winter. He lit the hearth. He fed them warmed bread, beef stew from the pot, and milk he heated on the stove. Thomas fell asleep mid-bite, spoon still curled in his small fist. James ate carefully, watching Edward over the rim of his bowl with guarded curiosity. Mary ate last, only after both brothers were served, and Edward noticed that too. 3 children slept by a blazing fire. Edward sat in his chair and watched them breathe, the firelight painting their faces gold and amber. And for the first time in years, his house sounded like something other than silence. 3 chairs at the table. Edward woke before dawn. For a moment, lying in the dark of his room, he thought he'd dreamed it. Then he heard the soft crack of a log shifting in the fireplace below, and the careful footsteps of someone too young and too practiced at tending fires in other people's houses. He dressed and descended the stairs. Mary knelt by the hearth, feeding kindling to the coals with the efficiency of a child who'd learned that a cold fireplace meant a cold welcome. "I didn't want it to go out, sir." "You don't need to tend my fire." "Mary." She looked up at him, a flicker of something uncertain in her eyes. "Force of habit, I suppose." "Well," Edward paused in the doorway, "I'm grateful for it. But from now on, that fire's for all of us. Not a chore. Understood?" She nodded slowly, as if testing whether the words would hold. He went to the dining room, stood before the long table in the gray half-light. Then, moving with a deliberateness that surprised even himself, he pulled 3 chairs from along the wall and set them at the table. He laid out 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 sets of forks and knives. He did it carefully, the way a man handles something sacred, adjusting each setting until they were spaced just right. His own childhood came back to him in fragments as he worked. Orphaned at 12, raised by Uncle Vernon, a decent man who gave him acreage, a handshake, and not a single embrace in 6 years. Edward had learned early that love was a thing other families had. Like pianos or painted shutters, you could see it through their windows, but it wasn't yours to touch. James appeared first, curious as a barn cat, asking about the mounted elk head, the height of the ceiling, whether the creek had fish. Thomas came last, carried down by Mary, his small face pressed into her shoulder. He watched Edward from across the room with enormous, cautious eyes that tracked every movement without blinking. The foreman, Hank, arrived mid-morning with a furrowed brow. "Boss, the whole bunkhouse is talking. You got 3 young'uns in the main house." "I do." "Folks in town are gonna have something to say about, let 'em say it. Hank, clear out them upstairs rooms, 3 beds, 3 dressers. Have it done by tonight." Hank studied Edward's face for a long moment. Whatever he found there closed his mouth. "Yes, sir." Edward Grant had spent 20 years building fences around his heart. That morning, setting 3 chairs at a table meant for 1. He opened a gate he didn't intend to close again, learning to be needed. The first week taught Edward Grant that managing 600 acres of cattle country was considerably simpler than managing 3 children. He burned oatmeal on Tuesday. He read a bedtime story so badly on Wednesday that James politely took the book and finished it himself. He discovered Thomas couldn't sleep without a candle burning. So he set one on the boy's dresser and told him good night and went to his own room. An hour later, he heard whimpering through the wall, soft, muffled, the sound of a child trying hard not to be heard. Edward walked back down the hallway. He didn't know what else to do. So he sat down on the cold floor outside Thomas's door, his back against the wall, and stayed there. The whimpering slowed, stopped. The boy's breathing steadied into sleep. Near midnight, Edward heard bare feet on the floorboards. Mary stood at the end of the hallway in her nightgown. Watching him sit on that cold floor, she didn't speak. Neither did he. But something passed between them in the dark. Something that words would have only diminished. She turned and went back to her room. And in the morning, she set Edward's coffee on the table before he asked for it. And her hands weren't shaking anymore. Small victories accumulated through the week. James discovered the horses, and within 2 days, had named every one and memorized which stall belonged to which animal. Mary offered to help with the ranch ledgers and revealed she could read, write, and calculate figures faster than most men Edward employed. Their father had been a school teacher before the typhoid, she said. And for a moment, her voice went thin and far away before she caught it and pulled it back. Edward rode into town for fabric at the general store. He overheard Jed Holloway telling the postmaster that Edward Grant had taken in 3 little strays like some kind of charity house. Edward set his jaw, bought twice the fabric he'd planned, and walked out without a word. One evening at supper, James set down his fork and asked a question so quietly it nearly disappeared under the sound of the fire. "Mr. Grant." "Sir, are we going to have to leave again?" The table went still. Mary's hand tightened on her spoon. Thomas looked at his plate. Edward met the boy's eyes. "No, James. You're not going anywhere." James nodded once, picked up his fork, and resumed eating as if the question had been about the weather. But his shoulders dropped an inch. and the tension that had held his small body rigid since the night in the barn released like a breath held too long. The hearth stayed lit day and night now. Edward found himself hurrying home from the range each afternoon. One evening, sitting at the table with 3 children eating biscuits and stew, James talking about the horses while Mary quietly corrected Thomas's grip on his spoon. Edward realized he hadn't eaten supper alone in 7 days. He couldn't imagine going back. Papa. The second week brought something Edward hadn't expected. Not just routine. What surprised him was wonder. These children, who had buried their parents and been turned away by every living relative, who had walked through snow and slept in strangers' barns, were remarkable. James could describe the ranch's geography after a single ride-along with Hank, naming creeks and fence lines like he'd been born to this land. Mary managed the household with quiet authority that would have impressed a military officer. And Thomas, the shy one, the silent watcher, had begun to emerge. He drew pictures, crude, beautiful little sketches on scraps of paper. Edward started leaving around the house on purpose. Horses, the hearth, the mountains through the parlor window. One morning, Edward found a drawing on the kitchen table. 4 stick figures standing in front of a house, a big one and 3 small ones. Above them, in Thomas's wobbly hand, one word, home. Edward pinned it to the wall above the fireplace and stood looking at it longer than a grown man probably should. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fried eggs. Edward had finally learned not to burn them. James was describing a hawk he'd spotted from the barn loft. Mary was braiding her hair at the table. Thomas sat beside Edward, close enough that their elbows touched, which was new. The boy had been inching closer each day. The way a wild animal approaches an open hand, one careful measure at a time. Thomas reached for the butter dish. His small fingers brushed Edward's wrist. And without looking up, as natural and unguarded as breathing, he said, "Papa, can you pass the jam?" The kitchen went still. Thomas froze. The color left his face in a single beat. He pulled his hand back and looked up at Edward with eyes so wide and terrified that it carved something open in Edward's chest. Because the boy wasn't afraid of punishment. He was afraid of being corrected, of being told he didn't have the right to use that word, of one more door closing. James stopped talking. Mary stood motionless in the doorway, one hand pressed white-knuckled against the frame. Edward's throat closed. He set down his fork. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't speak. Could only sit there with his heart hammering and his eyes burning while a 5-year-old boy stared up at him, waiting for the world to break again. Then Edward lifted Thomas onto his lap and wrapped both arms around him and held on. "That's just fine, son," he whispered into the boy's hair. "That's just fine." Thomas buried his face in Edward's shirt and gripped the fabric with both fists. James grinned so wide his whole face changed shape. And Mary, fierce and guarded and unbreakable Mary, pressed her hand against her mouth and cried. Not grief. Not this time. Relief. The first tears of relief she'd allowed herself since October. Have you ever heard a single word rearrange a man's entire life? 4 letters. Papa. And Edward Grant was never the same. That evening, after the children were asleep, Edward sat by the fire and stared at Thomas's drawing above the mantel. 4 figures, 1 word. He didn't need to think about it anymore. These were his children. by love, by choice, by every measure that mattered. Tomorrow he would ride into town and make it legal. The lawyer's warning. Edward rode into Briarwood the next morning, with his heart full and his mind made up. He hitched his horse outside the law office of Samuel Pratt, climbed the stairs 2 at a time, and sat down across the desk with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. I aim to adopt 3 children: Sam, Mary, James, and Thomas Colton. I want the papers drawn up proper and filed before the month is out. Samuel Pratt was a careful man. He cleaned his spectacles, aligned his inkwell, and folded his hands in that particular way lawyers fold their hands when they're about to deliver news that won't be welcome. Edward, I've known you 15 years. You're a man of good character and considerable means. Nobody would dispute that. Then there shouldn't be a problem. There is a problem. Pratt leaned forward. Sir, a bachelor adopting 3 children society will question it. Judge Harmon will question it. A single man, unmarried, no woman in the household. Folks will talk, and not with kindness. The court may refuse outright. I've got the means. I've got the land. Those children are fed, clothed, and loved. And none of that matters half as much as propriety in a territorial court. Pratt removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Consider marrying first. Edward. A wife in the home changes everything. For the judge, for the town, for those children's future. Edward rode home in silence. The road stretched gray and frozen between bare cottonwoods, and the sky sat low and heavy on the hills like a lid pressing down. The wind cut through his coat in places it hadn't reached in weeks, and the cold felt personal now, aimed at something specific inside him. The realization that love alone wasn't enough. That a system built by men who'd never knelt in a barn and listened to a child beg for shelter could decide whether his family stayed together or was torn apart. At supper, Mary was quiet. She'd set the table with her usual precision, but Edward noticed something that made his stomach drop. She'd checked the back door lock twice since he'd come home. She hadn't done that in over a week. Is everything all right, Mr. Grant? He looked at her across the table, those watchful eyes, measuring the silence the way she'd learned to measure silence in all those other houses where quiet meant packing. Everything's going to be all right, Mary. I promise you that. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and turned back to her plate. She didn't check the lock again that evening, but Edward saw her hand drift toward it once before she stopped herself. That night he stood in Thomas's doorway longer than usual. The boy slept soundly now. No candle needed. One arm thrown over the pillow and the other clutching a wooden horse James had carved for him. Edward reached down and brushed the hair from Thomas's forehead, and his hand was trembling. He would do whatever it took, whatever it cost his pride, whatever the town had to say about it. A desperate and honest advertisement. Edward sat at his desk the following evening and tried to write the most important words of his life. He'd written cattle contracts, land deeds, and bank negotiations without breaking a sweat. This was harder than all of them combined. He was writing a matrimonial advertisement, a plea, really, dressed up in newspaper ink. First draft, too formal. Second, too desperate. Third, too proud. Fourth, dishonest in a way he couldn't name but could feel like a stone in his boot. He crumpled each one and fed them to the fire. The 5th time, he stripped everything away, every pretension, every shield. He wrote the truth as bare as he could stand it. Wealthy rancher seeks wife willing to help raise 3 orphan children. 14 words. Everything that mattered and nothing that didn't. He posted it in 3 territorial newspapers and settled in to wait. The responses came over the following days. A widow from Cheyenne who mentioned the ranch's acreage 3 times and the children once. A young woman from Denver whose letter read like a business proposal. A shopkeeper's daughter who asked how many rooms the house had before asking how many children. Each letter made Edward's jaw tighten. These women weren't answering for the children. They were answering for the wealth. Meanwhile, the ranch had transformed around him in ways no amount of money had ever accomplished. James's drawings of horses covered the kitchen wall alongside Thomas's stick figures. Mary had organized the pantry with military precision and started teaching Thomas his letters at the dining table each afternoon. Laughter echoed through hallways that had known only boot steps and silence for 20 years. Thomas slept through the night now and had taken to following Edward around the ranch like a small, quiet shadow. His hand finding Edward's whenever they walked side by side. Edward was already a father in every way that mattered. He just needed the world to see it. Then Catherine Moore's letter arrived. 1 paragraph, no flourish, no flattery, no questions about acreage or room counts. The handwriting was neat and unhurried. A teacher's hand, steady and sure. Dear Mr. Grant, I read your advertisement and I want to be honest with you. I don't need wealth. I have a teaching position and a life of my own. But I'd love to mother children who need one. If you'll have me, I'd like to meet them. Respectfully, Catherine Moore. Edward read it 3 times. His hands trembled against the paper. He recognized something in those words. The same thing he'd felt kneeling in that barn on Valentine's night. Love that asked for nothing in return. Love that simply arrived and said, "Here I am." He wrote back before sundown. Now, out here folks have a saying. The right answer, don't knock twice. Edward Grant heard that knock. And for once in his life, he didn't hesitate to open the door. Miss Catherine. She arrived on the Thursday stage, carrying 1 trunk and wearing a traveling dress the color of blue sage. Catherine Moore was 31 years old, plain-spoken, and possessed of the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't need to announce itself. She stepped down from the coach, looked at the mountains ringing the valley, and took a breath as if she were drinking the air. Edward met her at the station. He'd rehearsed a greeting on the ride in. What came out was simpler. Thank you for coming, Miss Moore. Thank you for writing back, Mr. Grant. They rode to the ranch in a wagon, and Catherine asked about the children, their ages, their temperaments, what they liked to eat, what made them laugh. She didn't ask about the house, the land, or the cattle. By the time they reached the front gate, Edward had talked more in 20 minutes than he usually did in a week. The children waited on the porch. Mary stood in front, arms crossed, chin raised, the same posture she'd held in the barn that first night. James bounced on his heels. Thomas pressed against the porch railing, half hidden behind a post. Catherine stepped down from the wagon. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She walked to the porch steps, then knelt on the boards, bringing herself to their level. The same thing Edward had done in the barn, though she couldn't have known that, and looked at Mary directly. You must be Mary. Your father tells me you're a fine reader. What are you reading these days? Mary blinked. He ain't. She stopped, glanced at Edward. Something complicated and tender moved across her face. I've been readin' Mr. Grant's almanac, ma'am, and some of his newspapers. Would you like proper books? I brought 3 in my trunk. James inserted himself immediately. Do you know about birds? Miss Catherine, there's a red-tailed hawk that nests by the South Creek, and I've been trying to figure what kind. Red-tailed. You said those are magnificent. Show me tomorrow. Catherine sat on the porch step, smoothed her skirt, and waited. She didn't look at Thomas, didn't call him over, didn't try. She just sat there, patient as planted seed, listening to James describe the hawk's wingspan, and let the silence around Thomas remain unpressured and safe. 4 minutes. That's how long it took. Thomas inched along the railing, then down the steps, then across the gap between the post and this new woman who smelled like lavender soap and didn't grab at him. He sat beside her, not touching, close enough to feel her warmth. After a while, his shoulder leaned against her arm, and Catherine's only response was to keep listening to James as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Mary watched every moment of it with those fierce, assessing eyes, and for the first time since Edward had known her, something behind them unclenched. Over the following days, Catherine wove herself into the household the way thread joins fabric, without seam or force. She read to Thomas at bedtime, and he started requesting the same story twice, which meant he wanted her to stay longer, which meant he was already hers. She helped Mary with the ledgers and taught her long division, and the two of them bent over the table together, with their heads almost touching. She walked the ranch with James and named every bird he pointed at. One evening, after the children were in bed, Catherine sat with Edward on the porch. The stars were thick and cold above the valley. She was quiet for a while. I should tell you something. Mr. Grant, I was engaged once, years ago. He died of scarlet fever 3 weeks before the wedding. After that, I threw myself into teaching other people's children. She paused. I told myself it was enough, and it was good. But it wasn't this. Edward looked at her. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was giving him the truth of herself, the way he'd given his truth in 14 words in a newspaper advertisement. He felt his hand move toward hers on the porch rail. Their fingers touched. Neither pulled away. I didn't come for you, Mr. Grant, she said quietly. I came for them, but I'm glad it's you. It was Sunday morning when the children gathered in the parlor. Thomas held Catherine's hand. James held Edward's. Mary stood in the center, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the old rehearsal. No bargaining, no bracing for rejection, just hope, plain and unguarded. Miss Catherine, please marry Papa. We want to be a real family. Catherine's composure broke. Her eyes filled and her hand went to her heart, and she laughed through the tears. A sound so warm and startled and full that it filled every corner of that room. She looked at Edward. Edward looked at her. And the answer that had been in the house since the moment she knelt on the porch settled over all of them like sunlight. Chosen. They married on a Saturday in March, 3 weeks after Catherine's arrival. No society spectacle, no grand affair. Just the parlor of the Grant Ranch. A circuit preacher named Reverend Ames. Hank the foreman standing witness with his hat in his hands. And 3 children who could not stop smiling. Mary held a bundle of early wildflowers she'd found along the creek that morning. Stubborn little blooms that had pushed through the last of the snow. purple and yellow against her Sunday dress. James stood straight-backed and solemn in a new shirt, trying so hard to look like a man that it made Catherine press her lips together to keep from crying again. And Thomas held Edward's hand through the entire ceremony. Both small fists wrapped around his father's fingers, gripped so tight it whitened his knuckles. When Reverend Ames pronounced them man and wife, Thomas tugged Edward's sleeve. Edward knelt. "Papa," the boy whispered, on purpose this time, smiling this time, loud enough for everyone to hear. Edward gathered him up and held him, and Mary laughed and James whooped and Catherine pressed both hands over her mouth. And the old house, the grand and silent and too empty house, filled with a sound it had never known, the sound of a family finding itself complete. That evening, Edward and Catherine sat together on the porch while the children slept upstairs in rooms that smelled of wildflowers and new wood. The hearth blazed inside. The table was set for 5. Stars spread across the Wyoming sky in cold, brilliant rivers, and the last of winter's grip was breaking apart, the way it does when February surrenders to the stubborn, inevitable arrival of spring. "Thank you," Edward said. Catherine leaned against his shoulder. "You did the hard part, Edward. You opened the door. Now, I could end this story right here, and it would be a fine place to stop. But the truth is, the best part of any love story isn't the wedding. It's what grows from it. Years passed. The ranch prospered, but not half so well as the family inside it. Mary grew into a woman of uncommon intelligence and fiercer determination. She studied law by correspondence and became the first female attorney in the territory. Because nobody who had argued for her family's survival at age 11 was going to be turned away by a bar examination. James became a horseman of quiet renown and eventually managed the ranch, expanding it with the same steady patience Edward had shown him. And Thomas, little Thomas, who had pressed his face into his sister's back in a cold barn and whispered Papa like a prayer he was afraid to speak aloud, became a teacher, like his birth father before him, like Catherine. The dining table that once sat one was extended twice over the years. Holidays brought grandchildren clattering through the hallways, filling the house with the kind of joyful noise that Edward, in his younger days, would have found unbearable. He found it essential now, the sound of a life built on purpose. One Christmas evening, Thomas sat beside the parlor fire with his young daughter on his knee. She pointed at the old drawing still pinned above the mantel. Faded now. 4 stick figures in front of a house, and one word written above them in a 5-year-old's careful hand. "Who drew that?" "Papa," Thomas smiled. "I did, sweetheart, a long time ago, when I was just about your size." "Is that Grandpapa, the tall one?" "That's him. Your Grandpapa found us in a barn on Valentine's night, in the snow, when we had nobody, and he chose us." Across the room, Catherine, silver-haired and bright-eyed, still possessing that quiet certainty that had walked onto a porch in 1886 and never left, reached over and took Edward's hand, the same gesture, the same warmth. 30 years and counting, and it still said everything that needed saying. Outside, snow was falling on Valentine's evening, just as it had the night it all began, but every window in the Grant house glowed with amber light, and the hearth had not gone cold once in 30 years. Not once. Not since a wealthy man with an empty table heard a child's cough in the darkness and walked out into the snow to answer it. And that, friends, is the truth about wealth. It isn't land or cattle or gold. It's the number of chairs around your table and whether every one of them is filled with someone who calls you family. Edward Grant learned that lesson on a Valentine's night, kneeling in a barn, looking into the eyes of a girl who said, "We have no one." He gave them everything, and they gave him the only thing he'd ever lacked, a reason for all of it.